They demanded I tear down my wheelchair ramp, calling it an unauthorized structure. But they had no idea I was a disabled veteran. What happens next will leave you speechless. The crisp morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the distant hum of lawnmowers and chirping birds. The quiet suburban street, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and identical beige houses, seemed almost picturesque. But for Michael Carter, the serenity was nothing more than an illusion. As he rolled up the concrete path to his front door, the sight of a paper flapping against the wood sent a chill down his spine. His stomach twisted, a familiar knot of frustration coiling inside him. The notice was stamped in bold red ink, its message blunt and unapologetic. Remove the unauthorized structure immediately or face daily fines of $500. Michael's fingers tightened around the paper, crumpling the edges as he scanned the words again. Unauthorized structure? His wheelchair ramp, the very thing that allowed him to leave his house, was deemed illegal? The audacity of it was almost laughable, if not for the searing anger rising in his chest. He inhaled deeply, forcing himself to think rationally. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a direct attack on his freedom, his independence. And he had a very strong suspicion of who was behind it. Movement across the street caught his attention. There he was, Gerald Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed king of the HOA, leaning casually against his spotless white SUV. Dressed in his usual neatly pressed polo and khakis, he sipped his coffee with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just made someone else's life miserable. His eyes flicked up from his cup, locking onto Michael's. A slow smirk curled his lips. He had been waiting for this moment. Michael rolled forward, his wheelchair wheels humming against the pavement as he crossed the short distance to where Gerald stood. He held up the notice, the paper trembling slightly in his grip, not from fear, but from the sheer force of his frustration. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice steady but edged with barely restrained anger. Gerald barely spared the notice a glance. "Violation," he said smoothly, taking another deliberate sip of his coffee. "Your ramp. It wasn't approved by the HOA." Michael's jaw clenched. "I'm a disabled veteran. This ramp is necessary." Gerald exhaled through his nose, feigning sympathy. "Nothing personal. Rules are rules." The words made Michael's blood boil. "You do realize that forcing the removal of a disability ramp is discrimination?" Gerald shrugged, his expression unbothered. "I just enforced the guidelines. You should have gotten permission first." Michael stared at him, a slow, creeping anger settling in his bones. Permission? For accessibility? The sheer absurdity of it almost made him laugh. But this wasn't a joke. It was a deliberate power play. The neighborhood had always been a battleground of silent politics, where Gerald ruled with an iron grip. His authority over the HOA wasn't about maintaining order, it was about control. Over the years, Michael had seen neighbors bend under his relentless nitpicking, repainting their houses on a whim, paying unnecessary fines, living in constant fear of receiving one of his dreaded notices. Now, Gerald had set his sights on him. But what Gerald didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that Michael wasn't the type to back down. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made him glance toward the neighboring houses. A few residents peeked out from behind curtains, some lingering on porches, pretending to be preoccupied with their morning routines. They were watching, listening, but none of them dared to intervene. Gerald had them cowed, conditioned to accept his rule without question. Michael refused to be another one of his victims. "I'm not removing my ramp," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the still morning air. Gerald's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he recovered, chuckling lightly. "Well, that's your choice, of course. But the fines will start accumulating today. $500 a day adds up fast." Michael held his gaze. "You're targeting me. This isn't about HOA rules. It's about control." Gerald took another slow sip, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You're free to think whatever you like, but if you refuse to comply, the HOA has the right to escalate matters. We can take legal action if necessary." Michael's fingers curled around the wheels of his chair. He had dealt with bureaucracy before, tangled with red tape in ways most people couldn't imagine. This wasn't just an HOA dispute. It was a battle for his autonomy, and he wasn't about to let some overzealous committee rob him of it. "I'll see you in court then," he said, his tone calm, but his eyes sharp. Gerald chuckled again, but this time, there was a hint of uncertainty in his posture. "Suit yourself." Michael turned his chair around and wheeled back toward his house, the paper still clenched in his hand. As he moved, he could feel Gerald's gaze burning into his back. But he didn't look back. He had work to do, because Gerald had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the pristine lawns of the Oak Ridge Estates community. The neighborhood, with its meticulously trimmed hedges and uniform beige houses, seemed peaceful at a glance. But beneath the surface, an unspoken fear festered, a fear that stemmed from one man's iron grip over the community. Gerald Whitmore had spent years cementing his authority as the HOA president. To him, the Homeowners Association wasn't just about maintaining property values or ensuring aesthetic harmony. It was his personal dominion, a small kingdom where he dictated the rules and punished those who failed to comply. His power didn't come from kindness or charisma. It came from intimidation, from the silent compliance of those too afraid to challenge him. He ruled through a carefully constructed web of bureaucracy, hidden fees, and vague bylaws that he interpreted at will. If a homeowner dared to question him, they would soon find themselves drowning in a sea of violation notices, fines, and community-wide ostracization. It had happened to Bill Hastings, a retired veteran who had simply wanted to repaint his house a slightly warmer shade of beige. Gerald had rejected the color twice, each time demanding he repaint it to something more neutral. Bill had spent thousands of dollars trying to appease him, but nothing was ever good enough. In the end, Bill sold his home and left, another casualty of Gerald's unrelenting reign. And now Gerald had set his sights on his newest target. The first sign of trouble had been subtle, a letter citing a minor violation regarding trash can placement. The protagonist had dismissed it as standard HOA nonsense, unaware that it was merely the opening move in Gerald's larger game. A week later, another notice arrived, this time condemning his excessive lawn decorations. He frowned at the accusation. The only thing on his lawn was a single American flag mounted beside his porch. When he reached out for clarification, Gerald had responded with his usual passive aggression. "Rules are rules," he had said with a practiced shrug. "Perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right fit for everyone." It was more than a suggestion. It was a warning. At first, he had tried to ignore the harassment, but Gerald was persistent. His tactics escalated quickly. One day, his garbage pickup mysteriously failed to occur. The next, he received a fine for a supposed noise complaint, though he hadn't had visitors in weeks. Then came the whispers. Neighbors, once friendly and welcoming, started watching him differently. Conversations cut off when he approached. Some began avoiding him altogether. The community he had called home for years was slowly turning against him, and he knew exactly who was behind it. Gerald was orchestrating a campaign of social isolation, manipulating the residents into believing that the protagonist was the problem. A simple yet effective tactic. People were afraid to cross Gerald. They had seen what happened to those who did. But what Gerald had failed to understand was that his newest target was no ordinary homeowner. He had spent years in the military, navigating war zones, confronting real threats. He had faced enemies who fought with far deadlier weapons than fines and neighborhood gossip. Gerald was a bully, nothing more. And bullies had one fatal flaw. They underestimated their victims. Determined not to be driven out of his own home, he started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every odd occurrence, he compiled it all. He installed security cameras, ensuring that nothing could happen without being caught on tape. He began speaking to other residents, subtly gathering information about their own experiences with Gerald's harassment. The more he uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Gerald wasn't just enforcing HOA regulations, he was weaponizing them. Then, something unexpected happened. Late one evening, while reviewing his security footage, He noticed a shadow moving across his driveway. He zoomed in, his breath catching as he saw the unmistakable figure of Gerald Whitmore, standing near his porch with a clipboard in hand. He watched as Gerald inspected his property, muttered something under his breath, and then scribbled onto his clipboard. He wasn't issuing violations based on complaints, he was fabricating them himself. Armed with this new evidence, the protagonist knew it was time to strike back. The next HOA meeting was the perfect battleground. Held monthly in the community clubhouse, it was where Gerald paraded his authority before the homeowners, where he ensured that everyone remained in line. But this time, things would be different. As the meeting commenced, Gerald sat at the head of the long oak table, his expression one of smug confidence. He had no idea what was coming. "Before we begin, I have something to bring to the board's attention," the protagonist said, his voice steady. Gerald barely looked up. "If it's another complaint about fines, you'll need to submit it in writing." "Oh, it's more than that." The protagonist pulled out his laptop and projected a video onto the screen at the front of the room. The footage played in eerie silence. Gerald, clipboard in hand, pacing the property, writing up violations for imaginary infractions. Gasps rippled through the room. "Is this how you enforce rules?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet. "By fabricating violations? By targeting homeowners you don't like?" Gerald's face paled. This is taken out of context." "Is it?" The protagonist pulled out a stack of papers, flipping through them for the audience to see. "Because these are HOA reports. Dozens of them. They show a pattern, fines against specific homeowners, all of whom had voiced complaints against you in the past." The murmurs grew louder. A woman in the back of the room raised her hand. "I got fined for a flower pot. Gerald told me someone reported it, but..." She looked at the footage again, realization dawning in her eyes. "But no one ever did they?" Another man spoke up. "I had to repaint my fence twice. Because of him." The dominoes were falling, and Gerald knew it. His usual smug expression had vanished, replaced by something unfamiliar: fear. The meeting erupted into accusations. Gerald tried to regain control, raising his hands in protest, but the damage was done. People who had once feared speaking out now had proof of his corruption. His empire was crumbling before his eyes, and the protagonist sat back, watching it all unfold. He had fought real battles, faced real enemies. Gerald Whitmore had been nothing more than a pretender, a petty tyrant who had finally met his reckoning. This was just the beginning. The morning air hung still, thick with an unnatural silence. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin golden lines across the bedroom floor. The quiet should have been peaceful, but instead, it carried an unsettling weight. Something was wrong. Rolling over, he reached for his phone, its bright screen illuminating the darkness still lingering in the corners of the room. The HOA group chat buzzed with its usual complaints, someone ranting about barking dogs, another annoyed over an unauthorized garden gnome. The neighborhood's pettiness was a predictable part of his mornings, something he had grown used to, but today, it barely registered. There was a gnawing feeling in his gut, an instinctive warning of something amiss. He wheeled toward the front door, pushing against the armrests as he maneuvered down the short hallway. The rhythm of his wheels rolling over the hardwood floor was steady, controlled. He reached the entrance, unlatched the lock, and swung open the door. Then he saw it, or rather what wasn't there: his ramp, gone. For a moment, his mind refused to process the scene before him. The wooden planks that had once formed his only safe exit lay in shattered pieces across his driveway, jagged and splintered like the aftermath of a violent storm. His breath hitched. His hands tightened around the wheels of his chair. Panic and disbelief warred within him as he stared at the destruction. The ramp had been more than just a convenience. It had been his lifeline, his independence. And now it was gone, reduced to little more than scattered debris beneath the harsh morning light. A chill crept up his spine. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding against his ribs. The realization slammed into him like a freight train, He was trapped inside his own home. His fingers fumbled to unlock his phone, adrenaline making them tremble as he scrolled through his contacts. The call connected after 2 rings. Gerald. His voice was sharp, controlled, but there was no mistaking the fury simmering beneath the surface. My ramp is gone. A pause. Then a casual, almost amused response. Really? He could hear the smugness in Gerald's voice, could picture the man leaning back in his chair, that infuriating smirk on his face. Must have been some vandals. A slow, creeping rage coiled in his chest. Vandals, he repeated, his voice tight with disbelief. You think it's a coincidence that the one thing allowing me to leave my house was destroyed, right after you fined me for it? Gerald exhaled, the sound smug and dismissive. I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. A tense silence stretched between them. Then Gerald added, I guess you'll have to pay to reinstall it. If the HOA approves it this time. The audacity of the statement left him momentarily speechless. Gerald wasn't just toying with him, he was pushing, testing the limits of how far he could go. He wanted a reaction. It took every ounce of restraint not to let his voice shake with rage. You do realize this is illegal? Gerald chuckled. Good luck proving it. And then the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. He sat there, staring at the blank screen, his grip on the phone tightening. But it wasn't fear coursing through his veins. It was something colder, sharper, determination. Gerald had just crossed a line he couldn't come back from. He thought he was untouchable, that he was just another powerless homeowner in his little kingdom. But what he didn't realize, what would soon be his undoing, was that this wasn't just a petty HOA dispute anymore. This was war. He turned, rolling toward his desk, and powered on his computer. He accessed the security system, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. The cameras had been running all night. They never stopped. And now he was about to find out exactly who had done this. The footage loaded, grainy but clear enough. He scanned through the timeline, fast-forwarding through hours of stillness until, there, movement in the dead of night. 2 figures, one of them unmistakably Gerald. The glow from the streetlight cast harsh shadows over his face, but there was no mistaking the neatly pressed polo, the distinct posture of a man who carried himself like he was above the law. He watched as Gerald and another man, one of his cronies from the HOA board, tore apart the ramp with crowbars, their movements methodical, almost practiced. They had come prepared. They had known exactly what they were doing. His hands clenched into fists. He could feel the weight of this moment, the shift in the balance of power. Gerald had been so certain he was in control, so convinced that his authority was absolute. But he had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated him. With the footage securely saved, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Gerald had been playing a game, one where he thought the rules only applied to others. But he was about to learn a harsh truth. There were some rules even he couldn't break. And this time it wouldn't be a petty HOA fine he had to worry about. This time it was federal law. As he stared at the frozen frame on the screen, the damning evidence of Gerald's crime, he allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to destroy him. The days following the destruction of the ramp were a haze of strategy, sleepless nights, and an unwavering determination to bring Gerald Whitmore down. The morning sun slanted through the blinds of the protagonist's home, illuminating the remains of what had once been his lifeline, the shattered wood and twisted bolts strewn across the driveway. Each jagged edge was a reminder of the deliberate malice behind the act. But beneath the anger and frustration, something colder took root. This wasn't just about personal revenge. This was about justice. With steady hands, he turned to his security footage. The grainy black and white images flickered on the screen, capturing the movements of 2 shadowy figures. His heart pounded as he advanced the footage frame by frame. Then, there it was, Gerald himself, clad in dark clothing, his smug expression barely concealed by the dim glow of the streetlights. He moved with purpose, directing the second man like a commander overseeing the destruction of an enemy's stronghold. The protagonist clenched his jaw. Gerald had made a crucial mistake. He had left evidence. No amount of legal jargon or HOA technicalities could explain away the clear footage of him and his accomplice trespassing and vandalizing private property. But the security footage was just the beginning. Determined to build an airtight case, he began sorting through every notice, fine, and violation Gerald had thrown his way over the past months. The sheer volume of complaints was staggering. Most were laughably petty, claims of an improperly positioned mailbox and an unauthorized flower pot. But together, they formed a pattern of targeted harassment. It was during this deep dive into paperwork that he received an unexpected email from Bill, his neighbor. The subject line was simple: "Something you should see." The email contained a forwarded message originally sent by Gerald to the HOA board months earlier. As the protagonist read the words, a slow, disbelieving smile spread across his face. "We need to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. Enforcing stricter policies against non-standard property alterations will ensure the community remains uniform and desirable." And the only example Gerald had provided? The protagonist's wheelchair ramp. It was undeniable proof that this wasn't about violations or rules. It was a calculated move to remove what Gerald saw as an eyesore. Fueled by this revelation, he contacted a lawyer and filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Within hours, he was on a call with an investigator who wasted no time confirming that what had happened wasn't just unethical. It was a direct violation of federal disability laws. The security footage, the documentation, the email, they all painted a damning picture of Gerald's corruption. Still, he wanted more. He needed to expose Gerald in a way that would leave no room for denial. Over the next few days, he moved through the neighborhood, talking to residents who had been at the mercy of Gerald's reign. At first, most were hesitant. Years of intimidation had conditioned them to stay silent. But as the story spread, the floodgates opened. Bill shared receipts proving Gerald had pocketed HOA fees. Mark, another homeowner, revealed that Gerald had approved violations for his friends while denying similar requests from others. The most damning revelation came from Mr. Carter, a retired police officer. He produced official HOA meeting minutes with forged signatures, proving that Gerald had falsified documents to pass self-serving rules. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Gerald wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. He was a fraud, a manipulator, and a criminal. But the protagonist wasn't going to confront him in private. That would be too easy. The truth needed to come out in front of everyone. With a plan fully formed, he made his move. The night before the upcoming HOA meeting, he compiled all the evidence into an organized presentation. The security footage, the forged documents, the fraudulent transactions, every single piece of damning information. Then he made a final, decisive call to the HUD investigator. "If you want to see Gerald Whitmore caught red-handed, you might want to attend tomorrow's meeting," he said, his voice steady. The investigator hesitated for only a moment before responding. "I'll be there." As he hung up, the protagonist allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. Gerald had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, treating his position like a throne. But in less than 24 hours, that throne was going to crumble beneath him. The community clubhouse stood as a beacon of order in the neighborhood, its pristine walls and well-manicured surroundings a stark contrast to the tension brewing inside. Tonight, it wasn't just another HOA meeting, it was an event. Homeowners filled every available seat, their murmurs colliding in a chaotic symphony of curiosity and anticipation. Something was about to happen, and they all felt it in their bones. Gerald Whitmore, seated at the head of the long oak table, exuded his usual confidence. Dressed in his signature navy blazer, he adjusted his tie, his pen tapping against the tabletop in an absent-minded rhythm. His gaze swept over the room, taking silent inventory of who had come. He relished these moments, when the community gathered under his rule, looking to him for decisions, for order. But tonight, something was off. There were too many unfamiliar expressions, too many firm stares that didn't shrink under his scrutiny. Then the doors at the back swung open. The room hushed as the wheelchair rolled forward. The soft hum of its wheels against the tiled floor punctuated the silence, a stark contrast to the previous murmur. All eyes turned to the man at the center of tonight's storm. He stopped at the front of the room, placing his laptop on the table before him. A slow breath steadied him. The moment had arrived. "I have something to share with the community," he said, his voice even but filled with quiet resolve. Gerald's smirk barely flickered. "Now's not the time for personal grievances," he said, attempting to dismiss the tension. "Let's stick to the agenda." The man in the wheelchair didn't blink. Instead, he reached forward, tapped a button on his laptop, and the projector screen lit up. The grainy security footage played in eerie silence. The image, illuminated in the harsh glow of motion detection lights, was unmistakable. Two men, crouched under the cover of darkness, wrenching apart the wooden planks of a wheelchair ramp, and leading them, Gerald himself, his face fully visible as he yanked at the structure with calculated precision. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman near the back covered her mouth in shock. A man in the front let out a quiet but audible, "No way." Gerald's fingers, once idly tapping, now gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles blanched. His usual self-assurance wavered, if only for a second. But then he scoffed. "That proves nothing," he said, his voice thick with forced bravado. "This could be anyone." The man at the laptop turned his gaze toward him, calm and unwavering. "Really?" he asked, pressing another button. The footage zoomed in, freezing on Gerald's unmistakable face, the slight smirk still present even as he dismantled the ramp. Silence. The weight of the evidence pressed down on the room, suffocating the illusion of control Gerald had so meticulously built over the years. But the man at the laptop wasn't done. He reached for a thick folder beside him, flipping it open with deliberate care. "This isn't just about my ramp," he continued, his voice stronger now. "It's about everything." He held up an email projected for the room to see. It was a directive from Gerald himself, written months prior, discussing ways to enforce stricter policies against non-standard property alterations. The only example given, the wheelchair ramp. A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the room. Some leaned forward, reading the damning words with their own eyes. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But there was more. One by one, the documents were laid bare, bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals from HOA funds, emails proving Gerald had selectively enforced fines, violations that mysteriously disappeared for certain homeowners while others were punished relentlessly. And then, the final blow, an official complaint, filed with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The man at the laptop barely had to explain. The next moment, a voice rang from the back. "We've received a formal complaint and have reviewed the evidence." All heads turned as a tall figure stepped forward. The HUD investigator. "Mr. Whitmore's actions are in direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as several housing and property laws," he announced, his tone firm. "Effective immediately, we are launching an official investigation into the HOA and its financial practices." The clubhouse erupted into chaos. Homeowners who had lived in quiet compliance now found their voices. Accusations flew. "You fined me for having a single flower pot. You threatened to evict me over a mailbox color. You stole our money." Gerald, usually so poised, stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The sweat on his forehead glistened under the overhead lights. This is all lies," he finally sputtered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. No one believed him. The HOA board, scrambling to distance themselves, held an emergency vote on the spot. Within moments, the result was clear. Gerald was removed as president. But his troubles didn't end there. Within weeks, the legal consequences piled up. He was sued for harassment, financial misconduct, and violations of housing laws. The fines were steep, the legal fees suffocating. And then, the ultimate irony, his once pristine home, the one he had lorded over everyone from, went into foreclosure. One morning, the for sale sign was hammered into his front yard. The man in the wheelchair watched from his porch, taking in the poetic justice of it all. Gerald had built his kingdom on control, but in the end, it was that very obsession that had brought him down. And the neighborhood? Healed. The HOA was restructured. The ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules disappeared. People no longer lived in fear. As for the ramp, it was rebuilt, stronger and sturdier than before. This time, the entire community helped install it. The man sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, breathing in the freedom Gerald had tried to steal from him. Gerald had thought he could silence him, control him, break him. In the end, he lost everything. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, but it highlights the real struggles many disabled individuals face when dealing with unfair housing regulations. Issues of accessibility, respect, and legal rights should never be ignored. This story aims to raise awareness and encourage conversations about inclusivity and the challenges people with disabilities encounter every day.